Give it a few seconds. While that's doing that, I can share the screen that we will be studying from. There we go. And YouTube is just about caught up. Few seconds. Oops, don't need to hear myself. Thank you. Okay, and just minimize that. Pull it over there. Give myself a better view of comments. And bring that over there to view participants. Okay. Wow. With only 1 minute to go. I mean, we've did it within 1 minute. That's not bad at all. Okay. So just give a second for anyone else to join via YouTube, because that can take a little extra time. They have to wait until it says that I've got it up. And then once I've got it up, we have to wait for them to log in. Give it just until 12:02 usually is sort of our buffer zone. You know what? That's just about there. We can start a few minutes early, a few seconds early, and I think we'll be doing just fine. So welcome to the book of Shemot, the new book of Exodus. Well, I say new, it's a couple thousand years old, but it is going to be new for us for this year of 5785. As always, there are so many interesting things to say about every Torah portion, but I try to look for ones that I haven't covered or that I might have covered, but I'd like to cover from a different angle. And today we're going to be picking up in chapter 4 of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And we're going to start off with verse 22. Now, this is part of the conversation between God and Moses. In fact, it is at the very tail end of their conversation. And we're going to see the transition from here into Moses' journey back towards the land of Egypt. Most renditions, whether you're reading it as a summary of the parasha or whether you're reading a children's book or watching a movie, God help you if you think that actually reflects anything in the Torah, sort of glaze over all of this if they don't just omit it entirely. And we'll see why, especially the second half of the text that we'll be looking at today can be a little confusing. So it's understandable, but of course, for actual study, we don't just skip the things that are tricky. In fact, the things that are tricky demand more from us, and we try to give it our all. So let's go ahead and do what we can and see what's going on in this both beautiful as well as slightly confusing section of Torah. So chapter 4, verse 22, we begin. Then you are to say to Pharaoh, this is part of God prompting Moses of what his lines are going to need to be. Thus says Adonai, my son, my firstborn is Israel. So this is a incredibly powerful statement, and one that we're going to analyze in depth of what exactly is God claiming here and why is God claiming this. But this is part of the explanation that in context is meant to convince Pharaoh that Adonai indeed is going to make sure that these people are free. So this status as son, the status as firstborn seems to be important. And of course, it's linked in verse 23 to the final plague. I said to you, meaning said to Pharaoh, send free my son that he may serve me. But you have refused to send him free. So here, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So this is a very tight midah keneged midah of linking of how the Egyptians have treated us, and thus God will treat the Egyptians. If you are going to abuse God's firstborn, God's son Israel, then you are going to be forfeiting your own as well. And obviously, this is also meant as an echo of the murder of the Jewish sons that were born in the land of Egypt that were thrown into the river, one of whom, of course, was Moses. Note, however, that That killing was of all of them, whereas this is a more limited strike, if you will. And of course, this comes with warning and an easy escape clause, meaning that it doesn't have to happen if Pharaoh actually lets us go. So we have this as the tail end of the instructions. We are already seeing the end of the confrontation with Pharaoh here before it's even begun. And this is meant to be in our mind all the way through our discovery of the different plagues and the interaction with Pharaoh. We are supposed to still be thinking back over and over again to exactly this point, and to remember that this is in the chamber, if you will, that it is ready to go. And unfortunately, it looks like that with every step that this is the painful, inevitable conclusion that is getting closer and closer. Obviously, not the desired outcome. It would have been better had Pharaoh simply admitted that God was God and therefore the people could go. But as we know, that's not how the story unravels or unfolds, better word. Now, we skip or continue, and that's going to be a little bit of a question, into verse 24. On the one hand, it feels like a completely different topic, or rather a resumption of the narrative as opposed to the dialogue. But on the other hand, there may be reasons to think that these are thematically linked. So let's go ahead and see what happens here in verse 24, where it gets confusing and a little scary. Now, it was on the journey at the night camp that Adonai encountered him and sought to make him die. Okay. First of all, I have to talk about the elephant in the room, which is pronouns. Now, in general, Hebrew, like English, likes to use what's known as an antecedent noun. That is to say, a pronoun, in this case, the he, the him, and such, are meant to be pointing backwards to a previously revealed noun, and usually the most recently revealed noun. So on the one hand, there is an easy way to read this, which would be that Adonai encountered Moses and sought to make Moses die, substituting the word Moses for him, because Moses is the most recent masculine noun, apart from Adonai, and therefore that seems natural. On the other hand, that would make the sentence kind of crazy, because we just finished this whole discussion with Moses and God, and Moses saying, I can't go, I'm not able to, and God saying, oh yeah, you're gonna. To then immediately, the next verse, as Moses begins his journey, to have God try to kill him seems very, very counterintuitive. When we get into verse 25, we may find a different masculine noun that could be the subject of those pronouns. So let's take a look at verse 25. Zipporah, remember that's Moses' wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. Wait. First of all, where did Zipporah come from? Second of all, where did the kid come from? Well, obviously we know that Moses had children with Zipporah, his wife. And we know that from earlier that they were planning to go with him back into the land of Egypt. So what we see here is the introduction of this new male subject, his son, Eliezer, that this is perhaps a better match for the pronoun in verse 24. Perhaps it should read, now it was on the journey at the night camp that Adonai encountered Moses' son Eliezer and sought to make Moses' son Eliezer die. Now, we're still going to have to come back of why that would be happening, but that would be an alternative reading that would make sense given the information in verse 25. So what happens with the child circumcision, which is definitely happening in 25, regardless of our reading of 24? So Zipporah does the circumcision, and she touches it, meaning the foreskin, to his legs. And again, we have another ambiguous pronoun here. It could be her son's, which would be the antecedent noun, but it could also be Moses if that was our pronoun in the first verse we looked at. So she touches it to his legs and said, indeed, a bridegroom of blood are you to me. Now, again, very confusing. Bridegroom would seem to indicate that she is talking to Moses, who is, after all, her groom. But on the other hand, it is the legs of the child that are right there that she has just done the circumcision for, and that's the blood that's there. So it is a very confusing set of sentences, and we will be looking at these in detail as well with our commentaries. Continuing on verse 26, and he released him. Again, who was being released? At least the he here seems to be referring back to God, but even that is a little ambiguous. But it seems to be the whoever was about to be killed is now no longer going to be killed. And then she, Zipporah, we only have the one female noun, so that makes it pretty clear, said, a bridegroom of blood upon the circumcision cuttings. All right. So obviously, this is not self-evident. This is not something that reads itself, neither in the English nor in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, in some ways, it's even more confusing because unlike the way the English works, in Hebrew, oftentimes when there are verbs taking place, the verb will also imply a subject and a gender and a number without even having a pronoun strapped in front of it. So it's not something that is self-evident of what's happening here. This is why we study, because clearly it was important enough to include in the Torah. Clearly we are meant to learn something from this, and clearly we are not going to get that simply by reading the text on our own and using our own mind. It's something I'm sure many of you have heard me say before. This is why we don't keep only our own counsel when trying to study what God has given us. We instead have to rely upon not only our tradition, but also the interchange and discussion among the members of our tradition and among those of us alive today. The conversation is certainly not complete. Okay, so that's our template, our basic verses that we're going to look at, the description of Israel as God's firstborn, and the circumcision of Moses' child in this very confusing little episode. Any questions or comments before we look at our commentaries to try and help us on this? Okay, let's dive in. All right, so the first thing we want to figure out is, what do we mean when the Torah is saying that this is my firstborn? Well, Ba'atzekenim, and more as we'll see, take this as referring back to the sale of the birthright from Esau to Yaakov. Remember all the way back when Esau came in hungry and Jacob offered to buy his birthright for a bowl of soup. That was something that happened. And the Torah does not usually make categorical statements about the actions of the different characters. Instead, we are meant to glean from later text what the Torah actually wants us to know as a judgment of good, bad, or indifferent regarding their behavior. Up until this point, we aren't sure what the Torah thinks about that episode. The Atzekenim says that this is the Torah putting a stamp of approval, saying, indeed, that transaction was legitimate, that transaction was binding, and that means that from the line of Abraham, that indeed Israel, the specific person Israel, not just the nation Israel, counts as God's firstborn. And that was because of the line from Abraham, Isaac, and then into Jacob because of that sale of birthright. So this is getting an ex post facto validation for what Jacob did. Now, what does that mean? I mean, what's the purpose? What is the import, the significance of Israel having that that title? Is it just reserved for Israel, meaning Jacob, or does it mean Israel, all of us? It seemed to be the latter, because after all, this is where God is telling Pharaoh to let go all of Israel. So it's a little ambiguous even with that clarification, which is why the class is not only 15 minutes long. So let's take a look at Ibn Ezra. So Israel is my son, my firstborn. Right? That's our statement there. And Ibn Ezra expands that to mean the ancestors of this nation were the first to serve me. So firstborn here is not referring to firstborn just in a strict inheritance rights sort of way, which was the more common cultural meaning of firstborn. But here it is talking about a true sequence of events, meaning that Israel was the first nation, beginning with Abraham and coming through, who actually served God as God. Not with the various pagan idolatry or other forms of misguided worship. This was the first group. And therefore, that's why it's important to use in the explanation to Pharaoh, therefore I take pity on this nation as a father pities a son who serves him. You took him for a perpetual slave. I will therefore kill your firstborn son. So Ibn Ezra is saying that this is meant to be a clear statement to Pharaoh in language that Pharaoh will understand, that this group counts as my firstborn because they were the first to serve me. And you know what it's like to have a son who serves you. And perhaps you also know what it's like to have children that do not serve you, that are not positively disposed towards the parent, or more specifically, reject what the parent has tried to teach them. And for God, that's the way most of the world was at that time in history. And Israel was the group that didn't do that, that actually wanted to be together with God as Abraham first began. And therefore, Pharaoh should understand that God wants them free, that you made the one group who actually reaches out to me, your slave. And that is a pretty big problem. And therefore, contingent upon you not releasing them, your firstborn are going to be forfeit because you have taken mine. Okay, so this is continuing this idea that this firstbornedness is an inherited status, that it is based upon the past, and that it is being used to convince Pharaoh about the release because of God's special focus on this group. Chizkuni wants to create a little bit of nuance on that, and he's going to start us off with a very important reminder that all of God's creatures are his children. This is something that many people overlook, both Jewish and non-Jewish scholars of the Torah. Think that the Torah is exclusively focusing upon the Israelites, upon the Jewish people, and that's simply not the case. That all of God's creatures are his children. When it says that Israel is my son, it doesn't mean that no one else is. Indeed, that's why there's this differentiator of firstborn. That would be unnecessary if there was only one son. You don't have to say he's your firstborn if you've only got one of them. And we are reminded that all of God's creatures are God's children. However, Israel is the most beloved of his children, as when he created mankind, the species, it was for the sake of eventually there being a nation like Israel. We're going to have to come back to that in more detail with some of our later commentaries. But what is it about the nation Israel that makes it part of this teleological aim of creation, this purpose-driven reason for creation? Is it something just genetic? Is it something just historical? Or is there some other aspect, hint, it's the last one, that is making Israelness, Israel-ishness, whatever way you want to put that into an adjective, a main driver through the goal of humanity? So we're going to have to come back to that, but this is, in Chizkuni's word, what he means by firstborn. Not excluding the rest, but it is saying that Israel occupies a very special status, one indeed that is been pointing towards by all of creation. However, he's not 100% satisfied with this explanation, and so he gives the alternative exegesis, which we've already encountered in short. When Yaakov, that is to say Israel, purchased the birthright from Esau, and he eventually acknowledged that he had deserved it, I had been instrumental in this. And until Aaron became a priest, the temple service was meant to be performed by the firstborn. This is why I demand that you release my firstborn son to perform the service for me in the desert. So this is hinting back to something we've talked about in previous years, where prior to the election of Aaron and his family as being the Kohanim, that all of the sacrifices were being performed by the firstborn of each family. That was a more shared duty, if you will. And then Aaron and his sons took that over on behalf of all of us. So at this point, prior to Aaron's election, we would say that indeed, these are the firstborn and they are my priests. They need to serve me. And again, this would be something that would be compelling to an Egyptian, that, if you don't let the priests do the job that God wants them to do, that the God's going to be angry, and that's a problem. So even within the polytheism of ancient Egypt, this could have convinced Pharaoh to release the people for the worship that was being requested. Obviously, it doesn't, but that's because Pharaoh is incredibly arrogant and refuses to acknowledge anything different than what he already believes, or more specifically, any system in which he is not already at the top of the pyramid. All right, let's take a look at Rashi on this same topic. The term firstborn denotes high dignity. As in Psalm 89, I will appoint him a firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. This is the literal meaning. It's always nice when Rashi tries to spell out when he is speaking in Peshat, the simple meaning. And here he is trying to say, yes, we can argue about what it means to be the firstborn, but really in a simple meaning, a Peshat meaning, this is simply a compliment. It's saying Israel's got an A+. That's all. It is not meant to indicate any greater insight into the nature of reality, the nature of the nations, or anything else other than, I really like these people, and you've made them slaves. That's not good. So that is a Peshat reading. Midrashic, however, is the one that we've encountered as well. Here the Holy One set his seal to the sale of the birthright which Jacob had purchased from Esau, mentioned in more detail in Genesis Rabbah. So Rashi sometimes will only bring a midrashic comment, sometimes will only bring a peshat, sometimes he feels that we need to give a little bit of both, and that's what he does here. That we don't want the midrashic to make us think that's the full and primary reason for this statement being made, but also if we just said it's a compliment, we would be missing out on the element that this is also going back to that sale of birthright from Esau, that there is a line. Now, up till here, you'll see that most of what we have so far is a historical drive. That is to say, it goes back either to Abraham as the first to serve me, or it goes back to creation as Israel is the point, or it goes back to Esau and the sale. But it is basically Israel is my firstborn in the sense that they have this status because of what happened in the past. We're going to see that is not necessarily the only way to read it. Picking up with Sephono, for example, even though when it comes to the period known as the end of days, God will cause the kind of upheaval which will result in all the nations calling God by his chosen name, and they will all serve him without reservations, even then, Israel will still be special, inasmuch as it is my son. All right, so Sforno is looking the other direction down the timeline. He is saying this statement of Israel, my son, Israel, my firstborn, is not just a statement about what has happened in the past that gives them status at this moment in Egypt, but it is actually a statement about, because of what will come in the future, don't think that changes their status now. So in the future, all nations will no longer engage in polytheism or other aspects of idolatry that have been so corrosive to humanity. All nations will worship God. There's a lot more detail from many different sources about each one having variety in the way they do that. It's not that they will all be Jewish, but all will finally be on the same page, recognizing we come from that same God. However, even under those circumstances, it's not just a comparison between idolaters and non-idolaters, but even when everybody has been brought under the umbrella of God's teachings, still, Israel will have a special relationship. As he goes on to explain, I relate to Israel as a father relates to his son, not as a master relates to his servant, even the most benign of masters. A servant's loyalty or love for his master is based on his expectations of reward or his fear of punishment. Not so a son's loyalty and love. An additional reason for my preference for Israel is the fact that it is my firstborn son. It is the first nation to accept my position as creator, king, master in this universe. At a time when all the other nations were still following their misguided theologies, only the Jewish people proclaimed me exclusively as their God and lawgiver. All right, so obviously at the end here, Sforno slips back into the "it's because of the past" explanation. But notice in the middle that he is still teasing a concept that is discussed in various parts of Jewish scholarship, that at the end of days, yes, everybody will come to recognize God as God, but there is a different way to recognize. That is to say, when there has been upheaval, when the world has been shaken, when it has been made clear through struggle and turmoil that God is God, that the acceptance of the world of that fact is wonderful and will move us into that state of redemption. But we also have to recognize that it is a little bit bandwagony, that it is a little bit later than one would like, and that there are motivations, meaning getting on board because, hey, this is clearly the winning ticket, or hey, if we're not, we might be punished. Whereas Israel, because they related to God much earlier, before there was an expectation of reward or punishment, their relationship is a different type. Their relationship is more like father and son. And indeed, throughout the last couple thousand years, it's important to realize that Israel has maintained that belief and relationship to God, despite the fact that usually rewards and punishment were available more because we didn't give up our Judaism, or we would be rewarded if we did. And we seem to work contrary to what would have been normal or natural to expect from the average person. So Sforno is doing a little bit of mixing of the future and the past, which is going to lead us a little bit farther forward, hopefully into our next text. So Mek Hadavar says, all the nations of the world are part of the purpose of creation, right? God did not make the world just for us, the people of Israel, the Jewish people. God made the world for everyone, and everyone has a part. However, even if they practice idolatry, nevertheless, there are pious Gentiles in every generation who recognize the honor of Hashem. That is something Judaism has always believed and will continue to always believe. It is not only Jews that are good people. There are good people found everywhere. And sometimes it's, amazing how good a person can be under the terrible circumstances in which they might live. However, Israel is compared to the firstborn son of a king that inherits the crown. Moreover, even during the lifetime of the king, he assists in ruling the kingdom. In the same way, Israel assists divine providence and the running of the world. So what he's trying to make us consider is that it's not just about, we're God's children, no one else. No, everybody's God's children, and there are good people everywhere. That should not be what we take away from. We should not take away from this verse some form of Jewish chauvinism. But we can recognize that Israel has had a special role up till this day, that with the beginning with Abraham, but then especially through the giving of Torah and the living of Jewish life, that we have been assisting God in a way that, well, other nations have not consciously been doing so. Even the righteous among those nations have not necessarily taken on the same role of serving God in this particular way. And that is essential to understanding what is being used here as firstborn. It's not just about a special status. It is about a special responsibility. It is about a special duty that Israel has. And that really is going to help us transition then into Rabbeinu Hananel as he tries to analyze that at the beginning of our next page. So, if God had delivered the Israelites under Pharaoh's control in order to discipline them somewhat, this was not because he, their God, had rejected them. So we know this from Moses telling the people, Deuteronomy 8, that any discomfort they had ever been subjected to in their journey was due to the discipline administered by a loving father to miscreant children. The father does not enjoy punishing his children, but it is necessary in order for them to learn that misconduct carries a price. So calling them my son, calling them my firstborn, is trying to make sure that Pharaoh understands that even though God allowed them to be enslaved, that did happen, that doesn't mean that God had rejected them, that their enslavement was not a form of God's displeasure. It was not a form of rejection, that it was a form of discipline. Well, enslavement has other reasons, but in later passages, such as Deuteronomy 8, we're talking about other things where it was more deserved, and that was not done either as a form of rejection, but as a form of education, as a form of teaching, that when you do something wrong, wrong things will eventually come of it. That's kind of what wrongness means. However, Pharaoh had greatly exceeded the authority he had to be God's agent in educating the Israelites, meaning that while Pharaoh might have been doing fine because, well, God did say that we would be slaves in Egypt, or slaves in the land, rather, the way he treated us, the murder of the children and the harshness of the labor, that was above and beyond anything that God had originally earmarked as part of that experience. As a fitting retribution, God would kill Pharaoh's own firstborn during the last of the plagues. When God referred to the Israelites as my son, my firstborn, this was a complimentary description of them as for in existence in the line, children of the living God in Hosea. So what Rabbeinu Hananel is trying to say here is that the firstbornedness is a compliment to them to show that they have not been rejected. However, it is also a reminder that there are going to be, well, tests, that there are going to be a constant stream of opportunities for Israel to do the right thing or to do the wrong thing. And when they do the wrong thing, well, then bad things will come of that. You can't murder someone and expect to get away scot-free. It is going to come with problems. And therefore, we shouldn't expect the problems that the Israelites had as a symbol of rejection. We should instead assume that those problems came about because, well, that's the normal consequence of people making bad choices. So what does this all mean in total? And where am I going with this before we start talking about the mysterious circumcision case? Well, essentially what this means is that our firstbornedness is a title that is meant to be continually earned. While it's true that we will never be fully rejected and never be cast off, as the prophets have made abundantly clear in multiple passages, it is also true that we are called firstborn because not just of a historically inherited position that we have thanks to a purchase of a birthright, but that we are called that because we have had the special privilege of coming from a family that understood something about God before other people did, and that position, that early understanding, has come with a responsibility to live a certain way and to live as an example of that idea in order that other people will also be drawn to it. So this firstbornedness is not all about privilege. This firstbornedness is about living up to that obligation. With that in mind, then, we can see the failure to live up to that obligation as being our segue into the question of the circumcision that takes place in the following verses. So we're going to move into that right after I have a little sip of tea. All right. So Rashbam, who is very much keen on Peshat, always likes to give us a quick summary. Why was this going on? Why was this he seized him to kill him happening? Moses' sin consisted of needlessly slowing down the carrying out of his mission by taking his wife and children along. So Rashbam gives us the shortest explanation, which is, yeah, there was a problem. He still hasn't identified exactly who it was, in this comment at least, but the problem was Moses was going slowly. That He had a job to do to liberate the Israelites, and he's bringing his wife on the job and kids along on the job. And that is just by necessity going to make things harder. And well, God didn't tell him to bring his family. He should have realized that bringing his family was going to cause a delay, and therefore he is rightly experiencing whatever it is that's happening in here. Now, why would having his family with him cause a delay, and what might that delay be? Well, Ibn Ezra gives us a fuller picture and is slightly at variance with Rashbam's understanding. So they, meaning the ancients, and we as well in this case, had a tradition that a child should not be circumcised on the 8th day if he was sick, or while traveling, when it was not possible for his guardian to tarry and circumcise him. So, basic rule of halacha, if you are the parent of a child and the child is ill, we do not hold the Brit Milah on day 8. As important as it is to do it on day 8, that is only under healthy circumstances. If it would endanger the life of the child, then we absolutely postpone until there is no longer a danger. Also, if you are traveling and you can't stay in one place and make sure that the child is going to be fine afterwards, even if the child is not ill at the time of the circumcision, that continued movement might create illness, and therefore we postpone the circumcision in order to make sure. Now, that's not normally a problem nowadays, because most of us are in better control of our travel schedules, and we normally aren't going on long journeys, by camelback in the middle of the 9th month of pregnancy. But ancient world, they who did not always get to choose how they were traveling around. Now, that's the general rule. Now, because Moses could not tarry in carrying out God's mission, he concluded that he should not circumcise his son, because the child would be in danger if he were taken along. So that's very much in keeping with the rule that Ibn Ezra is describing. It makes perfect sense. Look, I can't put off doing what God has asked me to do, to go and talk to Pharaoh and free the people. And since my kid needs to be circumcised, but I can't wait to make sure that he's okay, because, we're on the road and all of that, then I guess I shouldn't circumcise my kid right now. And you can see that he is actually doing a 180 in his interpretation of Rashbam. It's not that Moses was slowing down to take care of his wife and kids, is Moses thought he couldn't slow down to take care of his kid after a circumcision, and therefore he put off Brit Milah. God therefore sent an angel to tell Moses to put his decision aside and to circumcise the lad. The child would then remain with his mother until healed, and Moses would continue on by himself. So the angel shows up to say, Moses, there's a solution here, right? Now coming back to Rashbam's idea, don't take your wife and kid with you. Do the Brit Milah. They'll stay, and the kid can recover perfectly fine, and you don't have to delay and get on with the business of setting the people free. That there was a solution that Moses had not been able to see for himself, and that this episode is essentially that jarring realization that there is a better way to do it, and that's where the actual circumcision takes place. And then Moses would continue, and Zipporah and the children would stay behind, which is why we get to see them show up later on in Parashat Yitro, even though they had begun the journey with him earlier on. So it neatly accounts for how they appear later when it looked like they were already there, and it also accounts for what's taking place here. However, what Ibn Ezra has not 100% clarified for us is who exactly was ill and why. So let's go ahead and take a look at our next commentary. This is also from Ibn Ezra, as he tries to figure that part of it out. And Ibn Ezra likes to work through his grammar. Its meaning is that God sent an illness upon Moses because it did not occur to him, meaning that Moses had this illness, had this seizure of near death, because he had not realized that the obvious solution was to circumcise his son as appropriate, but leave him with his mother as would be fine for his recovery while he went on so as not to delay. This is the meaning of an angel sought to slay him. God sought to slay Moses if he would not circumcise his son. don't put off circumcising your son in order to free the Jewish people. Circumcise him now and leave him with his mother to heal and get on with it. Now, we can see here this is ultimately coming back to our discussion about firstbornedness, because how can Moses act as the redeemer of the people? How can he act as an agent of God on behalf of the commandments, the mitzvot that are going to be transmitted, if he himself is missing the simple solution of how to fulfill both commands? Our lives are going to be filled often with multiple responsibilities and duties, multiple commandments overlapping. And if Moses can't figure out how to reconcile those, how to prioritize those, and how to handle them, then we're all going to be in a world of trouble. So this is the situation that Ibn Ezra sees Moses in. Now, because Moses was seized with trembling, he had this illness, he could not circumcise his son. Thus, Zipporah circumcised him, for Moses revealed the secret to her. Moses said, the boy, he needs to be circumcised, and she took care of it. However, Rabbi Samuel ben Hophni says, perish the thought that God would seek to slay Moses, who was on God's mission to redeem his people. Like we talked about before, making the pronoun him refer to Moses seems very counterintuitive, even with the duty of having to circumcise being so important and Moses needing to get this right. Making Moses almost die after we just said, Moses, you're the only guy for the job, really seems counterintuitive. Instead, it was Eliezer, the boy, whom the Lord sought to slay. And it is to Eliezer that the third-person pronominal suffix refer. The third-person pronominal suffix are the parts that appear at the end of a word in order to tell us him, her, they, our, those kinds of things. It's unlike English, where we always have our pronouns separate as a separate word. In Hebrew, oftentimes they are just a suffix that are attached to the end of other words. Scripture then goes on to explain that the reference is to Eliezer. Scripture therefore states, and cut off the foreskin of her son. He is not at first mentioned because he did not as yet have a name. Wonderful solution for Ibn Ezra. Why didn't we say God tried to kill Eliezer? Well, because Eliezer wasn't Eliezer yet. After all, it is customary not to give the child the name until the Brit Milah, until the act of circumcision. So what name could have been used? Now, we could have used perhaps another noun, but we do also see that in other passages, similar things occur. Genesis 38, and it came to pass when she travailed that he put out a hand. In that particular case, we're talking about Judah and Tamar, and the first baby puts out a hand. It doesn't say the first baby, it just says his hand. Well, whose hand? Well, the hand of the baby, but the baby hadn't been born or named yet. In fact, that's how he gets his name. So therefore, we don't use a name, but we still use a pronoun as though we had already introduced the character. So English grammar and Hebrew grammar are not one-to-one, and even in English grammar, sometimes we make some varying choices for stylistic or content reasons. So Ibn Ezra tells us, don't sweat it. It's perfectly fine that this is the way it's written, and it's not a problem at all that it's referring to somebody who has not yet been mentioned in the sentence, because that person does not yet have a name. So for Ibn Ezra, Eliezer was the target of the illness and in the final analysis, and that is because still of Moses's problem. Now, we might scratch our head and say, but why should Eliezer suffer just because his father did something wrong? Well, quite frankly, that is par for the course. And I don't just mean biblically speaking, but I mean historically speaking, that very often children are the ones who suffer the most for the poor decisions of parents. And we can see that here, and we can see that in numerous other places. After all, Joseph ended up in Egypt only because his father did not properly raise his children to avoid the jealousy and the rivalry that he fostered that led to his sale into slavery. So oftentimes children will suffer on behalf of their parents. This is generally speaking, what we mean when we say that the sins of the parents are visited upon the children. It doesn't mean that they count as having sinned. It means that those children will suffer the repercussions of the transgressions of the parents. All right, let's just finish it up then with one last teaching here from Chizkuni, trying to bring it all together, hopefully. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the angel attempted to kill Eliezer, the uncircumcised baby, taken from the Talmud. This is why Tzipporah called her son Eliezer a groom acquired through blood. So that was a bonding moment, if you will. A different interpretation. The angel tried to kill Moses. We're back to that again. He had been guilty of not circumcising Eliezer on the 8th day of his life, as God had commanded that it be done. He should have done so and left him with his mother in Midian. This would have enabled him to carry out the mission entrusted to him by God without delay and without holdups due to consideration of the needs of his family. Instead, he had walked slowly with his family, walked slowly while his family was riding. So while it was great that he put his family on the donkey or camels while he was going, that wasn't the proper solution. Now, what do we get from this final analysis here of bringing it together of it was Eliezer, no, it was Moses? Well, the short of it is that this debate is going to continue until Mashiach comes and we get a full analysis of this from the deepest depths of Revelation. But what do we learn from it in the meantime of whether it was Eliezer, whether it was Moses, and why it might have been happening, and why it's coming right after that statement of Israel's firstbornedness? Well, our job, as we've seen in that firstbornedness, is to serve God. That was why we were asking to leave Egypt. It is why God tells us that he chose to take us out of Egypt. It is to serve God. And we do that through the mitzvot, through the commandments. One of the first commandments, indeed the first that we received as a Jewish people through Abraham, is the act of circumcision. And we have to understand when that is necessary and when it should be delayed upon, certain other circumstances. Moses seemed to be doing this a little wrong right at the outset. And regardless of how we eventually want to settle the argument of who was being attacked at this point, we have to understand that the reason for the attack is if we're not going to keep the commandments, then we're really in a bad situation. If we're not going to keep the commandments, then our firstbornedness is not going to be at the forefront of the world's mind. Doesn't mean we'll ever be rejected, but it does mean that we will nonetheless have a much harder time of it. That status may not be revocable, but it can certainly be delayed in being beneficial to us. And so we can see that even Moses had to have a little course correction here at the beginning of his mission before he has to act as not just lawgiver, but also role model for the nation. And we, too, have to make sure that we are always doing our necessary course corrections, as we, too, are meant to be role models for our communities, for our families, for everyone around us. That's why we're here. And it is only through people behaving that way and focusing on that kind of goal that not just we, but the whole world will benefit. Okay, we will finish there, and I'll just leave it for a second to see if there are any questions in chat or through Zoom, or additional comments as well. I feel no obligation to always be the last word, but seeing none, we will go ahead and leave it there for today. Take care, everyone. Be well, keep studying, and see you as we continue our